In this third week, we're going to be talking about the rehabilitation process and case management and job development and job placement. With regard to the rehabilitation process, as you observed in the first week, the basic concept of getting people back to work in proprietary rehabilitation is different than in the public sector. The concept is one based more on an insurance model of payments and insurance model of dealing with loss. And that model basically says that you want to get the person back to what he or she was doing at the time of the injury or the accident. Now, obviously, that doesn't always occur as easily as I can say it should occur. So basically, what you do in the rehabilitation process and in case management in rehabilitation is, after the person has been injured or after the person has missed time from work, there's a period of recovery. And that period of recovery goes until the person has been determined to be at maximum medical improvement. Now, historically, the way that has worked is that rehabilitation nurses, people with nursing degrees, have been assigned to work with and monitor the individual with regard to getting to this magical level of MMI. And the nurse, and sometimes it's even a vocational person, because there is a gray area here, would work with the individual, work with the employer, work with the physician or physicians to make sure that the person is doing the things that are needed in order to have a maximum amount of recovery from the injury or accident. Once that person gets to MMI, then they would be determined to be able to be at a level that would be as good as basically they're going to get. Now, other things are happening parallel to this. One of the things to kind of confuse you is that when a person gets injured, they file an injury or an accident report. Now, that's very different than filing a worker compensation claim. When a person files an injury report, it basically says, I am injured, I've been injured on the job. Now, a lot of injuries don't require missing any lost time. Some injuries require the person miss time. In many cases, people get injured and they may have to miss a few days or a few weeks, and then they return to work and do the same job they were doing, and life goes on. In other cases, the person may be such that the injury is such that the individual is going to be unable to return to the work they were doing at the time of the injury, and it may very well be that the employer has an alternate job that that person could do, or a modified job that that person could do. Now, our involvement could occur, and in my way of viewing this, should occur before the person reaches this magical MMI. In other words, we should be working with people early on. The earlier that you can work with somebody, the more likely you're going to get a positive, a good result from rehabilitation and return to work services. So what you want is you want to get a referral early on in the process. Now, we don't control when a referral comes into us. That's controlled by insurance companies, by the individual, by attorneys, by people beyond our control, sometimes even physicians. So what we want to do, however, when we do get a referral, is we want to make a determination, and we make that determination through interviewing the individual and getting the medical reports, perhaps contacting the employer, perhaps contacting physicians or healthcare providers, and we may even have to contact the individual's attorney, if indeed the person does have an attorney, in order to be able to proceed. But what we want to determine, in addition to some of the basic issues such as the age, the education, the employment, any transferable skills, the nature of the injury that the person's had, and the person's perception as to how that injury affects him or her, we want to determine whether indeed the person is going to be able to return to the past work that the person was doing, and we do that by looking at the medical reports and also talking to the individual. And then counseling can come in when we might have a situation where the medical reports say this person can go back to work doing what they were doing, but the person says, no, I can't. I'm in too much pain. I can't go back to work. And of course, pain is an issue that we deal with because it's one that many individuals report, and it's frequently very difficult to get a handle on because there's a great degree of subjectivity in terms of pain, and different people have different thresholds for pain. So there are a lot of issues that we need to address when it comes to trying to understand the concept of pain. And it's a very complicated issue. Many physicians will tell you that it's difficult to determine. They might tell you that you look at somebody and you look at the nature of the injury and you try to make some sense out of what level of pain you would expect with what kinds of injuries. And then you have the impact of medication on the individual and how that medication impacts the person's functioning and trying to alleviate pain, and does it have side effects that may prohibit the performance of certain types of occupations, such as operating of dangerous and hazardous equipment. So you're trying to understand and juggle all of these factors, and it can become very, very complicated. So, but what you want to do is you want to make an assessment as to whether this person is able to go back to work, whether this person feels that they can go back to work, and you want to determine whether the employer is going to take them back to work, and at what level, the past job, some other job, a modified job, and so forth. So this can become a complex kind of process to try to understand. Then you get perhaps influences where if the person doesn't go back to work right away, and of course a lot of the cases with individuals who go back to work right away, we never see. They never get referred to us because there's no need to. The person has the injury, they recover, they go back to work. They don't need our assistance. Our assistance comes in when you have a situation where it appears that the person is going to be having difficulty getting back to work, either in the past job or some other job. It may very well be that it becomes obvious that the person is unable to go back to the past work, but the person could go back to other work. And then you get into a situation perhaps where you might need to do some sort of vocational testing to determine what the person's abilities are. And that might be in terms of academic abilities or aptitudes or potential for retraining. And it's important perhaps in many cases to make a determination as to the types of job reentry program that might be needed. And you might, for example, have a case where you've got someone who's done manual labor or worked in a factory or done some other sorts of equipment operation, didn't have to use academic abilities, and didn't really have to use technical skills, but that person may not be able to do that kind of work again. And so we might have to look at the person and then make recommendations as to what other types of jobs they can do, either at the present time or with some degree of retraining. Now, of course, my bias in this is that the more education, the more training somebody has, the more marketable that person becomes, and the more stable that person becomes in terms of opportunities for different types of jobs, and of course the more money the person can earn. So I think education is certainly very valuable, and if that appears to be a realistic option for somebody. And typically in worker compensation and long-term disability, when we look at education, we're looking at not at four-year bachelor's degrees where somebody gets kind of a basic foundation in humanities and arts and literature and so forth, but we're looking at education in terms of some sort of direct link between going to school, developing specific job skills, and then going back to work. And of course in that kind of situation, many times you're also looking at people going back to work at salary levels less than they were earning before. And of course when that happens, you also have another current going on, and that's the current of a person trying to get as much money from the worker compensation case as they possibly can. So that's in some respects becomes a competing force. And so while you're trying to get the person thinking and motivated to return to work, you might have other individuals saying that you know, you can't do what you were doing before, and so any job that you can do is going to be paying less than you were earning before, so let's try to get as much money in this worker compensation case as we possibly can. Now, while the person is in some sort of recovery program, they are going through, they are being paid based upon this concept of temporarily totally disabled. It's like, I think as I've said previously, it's like having the flu and being off work for a week. They can't do anything while you're, you know, in this being sick and so forth. And in many states there are formulas for how much somebody gets paid when they're in temporarily totally disabled status, and that usually, or at least in Kentucky, that and it's different in other states, but it's 2/3 of the state's average weekly wage that the person gets. That's the money they're getting while they're not working because of recovering from the injury. Now, at the point where the person is able to return to work, if that person, let's say, is able to return to work and holding constant what we're doing, at that point, the person, if they have a permanent injury, if a doctor says that you can go back to work, you're released to work, and usually the release to work coincides with being at maximum medical improvement. If that were to occur, the doctor may say you have a 5% impairment. The person would then be eligible for some sort of payment based upon receiving a permanent injury at work. And when they receive a permanent injury at work, they are entitled to being compensated for it, just as any of us would be compensated for any type of loss, whether it's an auto accident or a theft or something along those lines. If you have insurance that covers it, then you can get compensated. So if you plug in these formulas, the person then would receive money. If they go back to work, you know, then they still receive that money, that 5%, or whatever the percent of disability is, based upon those formulas, or based upon some sort of agreement among the different parties about how much percent of disability the person might get. Now, as we've talked before, theoretically, the determination of disability is going to be the same no matter who the physician is, because the guidebooks that tell physicians and psychiatrists about how to determine permanent disability are roughly the same. So if someone has a surgery, or someone has an amputation, or someone has some sort of injury, the guidebooks say what the percent of disability is to be. And in looking at medical reports, I have seen that roughly they're in the same range. And there is some degree of flexibility in determining percent of disability, but roughly in the same range. If the person disagrees or feels that the percent of disability is too low, the person can then file a worker compensation claim. And when they do that, then they're basically saying, I feel that my disability, my injury is greater than what just these percentages of disability indicate. And going before a judge or a rehab panel or a board, then they can make their case and try to get a higher percent of disability. And that higher percent of disability brings in other factors that the person is hoping that a judge or a board will include in the percent of disability other factors that are known as these occupational disability factors, such as the age of the person, the older person saying it's more difficult for me to go out and find other jobs and get retrained, or the geographic location. The person might say, there are no jobs in where I live that I could do, or educational level, saying I've got only a 10th grade education and I'm competing with people with high school and more educations. So these are other factors that come into play. Now, we're not dealing with these directly from a rehabilitation perspective, but these are issues when the person who might file a worker compensation claim might be saying, I want considered before I can think about going back to work. And these factors and filing a worker compensation claim would tend to put the brakes on, or slow down at least, our rehabilitation efforts. And we may find that the person is very reluctant to consider returning to go back to work until they've had their claim adjudicated and determined. And that may delay the return to work process by months, depending upon what the situation is and what the backlog of cases is. So you might find that the person reaches maximum medical improvement in 3 months from injury, let's say, but because of filing a claim and wanting and feeling that the person is more disabled than the physicians have said, it may take 6 months or a year. And what we might even find is that when the person is ready to go back to work, they are so far beyond the point where they've been at work and been in a routine of going to work that return to work almost becomes impossible. And we may also find that this person has now applied for Social Security disability and is basically looking for additional payments for supporting the fact of being unable to work. So these are other factors that may mitigate against rehabilitation and return to work. Now, if we just consider the rehabilitation and return to work factors, what we would do would be to work with the individual to talk about alternate jobs, to talk about perhaps short-term retraining for these alternate jobs. Short-term retraining may entail on-the-job training or some sort of educational remedial program or some sort of program in which the person can learn, go to a technical school for a 3-month program to learn about basics in using a computer and using various softwares on a computer. Many states in their worker compensation program are reluctant to recommend formal retraining programs because they feel that their experience with these has not been very successful. So you don't see much formal retraining going on. When you do see it, it tends to be more for people who are younger individuals who are closer to being last in school and would appear to be able to benefit more from return to work and through a retraining program in a technical or community college. However, there are always exceptions to all of this. Another area that we might look at would be concepts, two concepts, one called work hardening and one called work conditioning. And in work hardening, what work hardening is that if you've identified a specific job that the person can go back to, and if you've got an employer willing to take the person back to that specific job, then a work hardening program would be such where a typically physical therapist or rehabilitation hospital program would simulate that particular job and condition the person to be able to perform that job before actually going into that job. Another Another program that frequently is used is called work conditioning. In work conditioning, the person goes again into a program usually sponsored by therapists, physical therapists, in which the person is generally reconditioned. Because what you also find, either before going into work hardening or work conditioning, is that a lot of individuals who have done manual labor, when they get injured, they will sit at home and become very sedentary, and they become deconditioned. So that even though the person might get to MMI, by the time they get there, they have been so deconditioned that you just can't put the person back to work and say, here's the job, now go back and do it. There may be this need for a period of work hardening to get used to doing another job, or of work conditioning to condition the person to be able to be physically able to do other work. Now, another complicating factor that we don't control completely in the return to work process, and one in which the getting to MMI can be delayed, is when the person is going to need surgery. And when the person needs surgery, you might find that there is a period in which the person, obviously if the person needs immediate surgery, then they have immediate surgery. But there might be situations where the person has a back condition, and so they go for a second opinion, and then it may go back and forth between the insurance company and the individual and the different doctors about whether the person really needs the surgery. And so it may take several weeks or months before it's even determined that the person does need surgery. And then if the person does have surgery, then you have a further amount of delay in terms of recovery from the surgery. And if the person has filed a worker compensation claim, you're going to have a further amount of delay before the person even gets to the point of adjudicating the case and saying, well, now I'm ready to go back to work. And as I said, the longer the person is off work and the longer the person is away from the workplace, the more difficult it is to return. That's why I advocate for some sort of early intervention program and some sort of program that keeps the person active and busy on an ongoing basis. Now, you also have a situation in which if the person is not active, they are not thinking about going back to work. They are not thinking about any of the types of things that we may present. The person is thinking about just the disability and dealing with the disability. We also have to consider the effect of significant others on the person. We walk a fine line in proprietary rehabilitation, in which that fine line being that we are told to really stay away from getting family members involved, but yet it's important to involve family members to see where they're coming from, to see what sort of support system the person has, to see whether the support system is encouraging return to work or encouraging the person being disabled. And therefore I think it's important to work very closely with family members to determine what they feel about the person and what they feel about the injury, and also to try to explain to them what we feel the person is capable of being able to do, and to go over the opportunities that this person has for being able to return to work. And so to me, excluding family members would be a mistake, and including family members is important to try and garner their support for the individual. Now, having said that, I think there are several psychological barriers that we also face in providing return to work services and case management services. And those psychological barriers are the fact of the injury. I think when people get injured, there's especially if it's a traumatic injury of some kind, even though it may not be catastrophic, just some sort of traumatic injury, there can be a fear of going back into the workplace again, doing the same job, and fear of getting re-injured. It may be that you've got a person who's had several related injuries, and this injury is such that they don't feel they can get back to work. And you also have, I think, a psychological barrier when someone's had surgery. And I think when you've had those factors, then I think that going back to work, excuse me, going back to work can be a psychological issue, especially if you're looking at the person with regard to going back to doing what he or she was doing before. So it's important to try, in my judgment, to think about those things and to address those issues with the individual. And of course, in many instances, if we look at alternative work, those alternative jobs are going to pay less, and then we're dealing with the issues of self-concept and self-esteem, and whether the person feels that they're better off going back to work, or perhaps staying at home and being perceived as having a disability which may have a higher social value for the individual than going back to a lesser, lower paying job for that individual. So again, these are factors that come into play for us that may influence rehabilitation and return to work issues. Another undercurrent that we don't fully control but may be present is the employer. Many employers are very willing to take people back to work and want to take individuals back to work, but you might find other employers who might look at the injury as an opportunity to say, well, this person has been a troubled employee, and not make many efforts to try to get the person back to work, and not make many efforts to try to find alternate types of jobs for the individual. So again, this is another undercurrent that we might deal with. But I would still make the effort to talk with the employer where the person was injured to see if there are jobs that the person can do, either the past work or other jobs, which would be available with that former employer where the person was injured.